We've seen this graph a bunch of times. For purposes of our conversation, we're really talking about this area here, time-phased requirements. Remember that definition of MRP? It started out with a time-phased approach. This is where it is, as we stated previously. We're going to do it now in greater detail. MRP item records. So what type of materials do we need based on a production schedule, which is driven by a forecast, at least initially? What do we need in this type of environment? Either ourselves as a manufacturer or our outsourced partners who are doing the manufacturing for us. That collaboration factor with external entities like a third-party manufacturer, really quite important. So just to bring this graphic back up and isolate what it is we're talking about here, whether it's raw materials or finished goods, if we are acquiring inventory on the buy side of the equation, the principles remain the same. Gross to net exploding, as it relates to MRP and purchasing, where it was born initially, it's an exercise, it's an ongoing activity, whereby the original or gross requirement for product is reduced by, as we've seen, inventory on hand or projected on hand, confirmed order receipts, confirmed order releases, and planned order releases. Let us reiterate once again, especially when we're dealing with raw materials, that the gross requirement is actually from the bill of material. How many pieces of a given item do we need to make this finished product? And that number is going to be dependent upon the production schedule. Remember, we forecast for independent demand items, finished goods. The raw materials that we need are dependent upon that forecast. So raw materials are not an independent demand item. Why am I saying this? Because the numbers that appear in the gross requirements in each time bucket, that's going to be the number of pieces that we need of a given raw material to go into that finished product. So if a cell phone, a smartphone needs 2 chips, and our forecast for finished phones is 1,000 phones in a given period, the gross requirement is going to be 2,000 because you need the bill of material tells us that we need 2,000 chips, 2 chips per phone in that particular period. Just important to bring that up again. So our exercise is the gross requirement. What do we think we need in each period? And how is that netted out? Because we have inventory on hand already. We know we have orders in the pipeline. And moving out into further time buckets, we have confirmed order releases and even planned order releases. As things change, as the sales and operations planning activity helps us to update our plans, more production, less production, more product acquisition, less product acquisition. All of these things are going to change moving forward, so the resulting figures will also change. That's what the software does. That's where that cascading effect comes in. But that's what gross to net exploding is. As we said previously, in bullet point number 2, we'll say it again, gross to net exploding must be integrated with the raw materials inventory management function. Clearly, if we need raw materials, that's an inventory management function. Purchasing has to be closely related to that, and sometimes even part of the same reporting structure, and certainly in some, if not many, organizations. So that integration is always a human element. There's a communication element. There's a reporting structure, organizational chart element, but certainly process design to drive home that point again, and supply chain software applications all play a role in that integration. Let's hit lead time offsetting again in an MRP and purchasing environment. Offsetting is really simple. Well, it's simple to talk about. It's not so simple to do, especially in a global context. But if you think about it, it's really planning ahead, determining when you're going to need product, raw materials, maybe finished goods if we're that wholesaler, but determining when we're going to need that material and moving backwards up the supply chain, taking into consideration all the activities that have to take place before we receive those goods and put us in a position to add up all those time periods and place an order at a time that accommodates the cumulative lead time. There's that definition that we brought up much earlier. So let's look at our hash mark in bullet point number 1. Orders are placed for product. It's us ordering. We as a company are acquiring product on a date that offsets cumulative lead times. So if we discover that our cumulative lead time is 6 weeks, we need to be placing orders 6 weeks before we need the merchandise. Pretty simple example, but that's really what it is. The key is understanding who all the players are, something we put some importance on earlier, who the players are in the supply chain, what they do, and how long it takes them to do that, and add them all together. That's what cumulative lead time is. So we saw this before. Let's run through it again. How long does it take for us as an organization to prepare a purchase order? You'd be surprised. It can sometimes take longer than you might think. And even if we place a PO on a vendor overseas, they sometimes have challenges accepting it or getting it into their system. Don't make assumptions about how long that takes. For a variety of reasons, I've seen it take days at a time. What's the production time for our vendor? What's that transportation lead time? Air versus ocean, truck versus rail, those considerations. Customs clearance, as we talked about. In today's world, you can have goods cleared before they even arrive at destination. If there are issues with documentation or questions that the customs entities have, I've seen that take weeks. If not, have seen goods get seized. So customs clearance, you need to have a clear understanding of that. And that domestic distribution environment as well. So we're adding up, we're identifying sources of lead time, bringing them all together, integrating them hopefully, removing dwell time where goods or information or documents are just sitting around, and we come up with a good, solid, reliable cumulative lead time that gets into the software and can be relied upon and used to create things like planned order releases or planned order receipts. This is what drives that in the software. So we have to, second bullet point, to make all that happen, integrate that lead time offsetting with the logistics function. These are logistics people that are going to execute on the lead time component, or at least many parts of it. Transportation, customs definitely, domestic distribution for sure. So that integration, human element, org chart structure, process design, and supply chain applications, all inputs that create the desired output of our MRP and purchasing process. We've seen this slide a bunch of times, and it hasn't changed much. It's just the topic is a little more focus. So our question becomes, if we are the buyer or the client in the lower right-hand corner, working in an outsourced environment with suppliers that aren't part of our company, they're third-party entities, the question becomes, and it's rhetorical right now, but we're answering it as we go, the question becomes, how do we execute on all these MRP functions that we talked about? How do we get this information into vendors' hands? How do we manifest that information in the form of a purchase order? How are those purchase orders generated by us? How are they acknowledged by our vendors? How do we know that our vendors have gone into production and that our cumulative lead time remains reliable? How does our vendor know what kind of documentation we need in the form of a commercial invoice, a packing list, maybe a certificate of origin, a hazmat certificate, any variety of things? How are they going to know how to prepare that documentation in such a way that our goods don't get stuck in customs and blow up our entire cumulative lead time? Again, rhetorical questions now, but major considerations in the real world, and we'll answer them as we go forward. So just an illustrative point here.